Ghostbusters!
You're listening to XVGM Radio. Welcome to XVGM Radio, where the bits keep coming. I'm Mike.
And I'm Justin.
And this is episode 7, Commodore 64 Downports. Now, you're probably very confused. And I guess allow us to explain. So this episode, we are going to be talking about the Commodore 64 and the games that were ported from their big brothers to these little 8-bit console.
Right. A game that was put out on possibly another 8-bit console or a 16 or 32-bit console that was then sort of brought backwards in time to this older 8-bit world.
Right, yeah, basically downported. This was a very popular thing to do in the late 80s, early 90s, just because consoles were very popular back then, and they were getting a lot of really strong franchise-based games, and so the Commodore 64 took advantage of that through various deals with different developers and publishers, so that's what we're going to be talking about. And the track that we came in on, 2 different tracks. The first part of the track was Ghostbusters for the Commodore 64, and the second part was New Ghostbusters 2, which was for the NES that came out in 1990, and that was a PAL and Japanese exclusive. So, yeah, what do you think of that little comparison?
I mean, I'll say that I'm a little bit upset that the second game was an exclusive that we didn't get.
I know.
That sounded awesome.
Yeah. No, the game is great. It's definitely way different than the first Commodore 64 track, which is more of a comparison or a better comparison with the first NES game, which is a terrible, terrible game in my opinion.
Yeah, no, the game wasn't that great, and the music was, not that it was terrible, but it was not, definitely doesn't measure up to what we just heard at the end there.
Absolutely.
But the Commodore 64 track was really interesting because it was very easily identifiable as the Ghostbusters theme. I mean, even without the Ghostbusters ECM sample there.
You mean Ghostbusters?
Yeah, that sounds more accurate, actually.
Yeah.
It was interesting to hear how they put that song together with the sounds that you can make with the Commodore 64, and that's not to say that the Commodore 64 doesn't have good music or doesn't sound good, because some of the tracks that we're going to play in a little bit sound really, really good. I enjoyed hunting for these for some of these games.
Yeah, it was definitely a challenge.
Very, very much so.
Yeah. So yeah, this is going to be kind of like a versus episode in the sense that it's the Commodore 64 tracks versus these supposedly superior tracks, and you can kind of compare and contrast. They're not always going to be the same track. We picked a lot of different stuff, and so we're going to play it for you. But first, the SID chip. That is the sound chip in the Commodore 64. So the SID chip, SID is short for Sound Interface Device.
Oh, good. I thought it was going to be something worse.
Yeah. What did you think?
Infant death chip.
Yes.
No.
Or soothing indigo Dulé. I don't know.
You're really reaching.
I am. I'm trying to think of something goofy. I don't know.
Soft inside door? I don't know.
Why do I keep going back to soothing?
Soothing, yeah.
Soothing, no. Screaming iron...
Death chamber.
Death chamber, there we go. Yes.
This chip was also used in a number of other Commodore consoles?
Computer consoles?
I think they're considered computers. So either way, so it was also used in the VC-10, which is also known as the Commodore Max, the C64, and the C128.
Yes. It has difficulty being emulated, even with today's advanced sound technology. I mean, it's mostly due to combining the analog and digital circuitry of the chip. So, you can get it to sound close, but it's not 100% perfectly emulated at this point. So
Interesting.
Yeah,
that's
kind of weird.
It's kind of cool. It's a reason to maybe own the console and get some of those sounds out of it. I said console. Either way. It also contains 3 tone generators that are known as voices.
Right, and there's 4 wave effects that make up the sound: the triangle, sawtooth, rectangle pulse with modulation, and white noise, which is generally used for drums.
Oh yeah, like the hi-hats or the cymbals and stuff. It's kind of white noisy.
Yeah.
So it has programmable filters with low pass, high pass, and band pass.
Yes, and there's more to this chip than this, But without getting too technical, it's easy to see how advanced this chip was and how it was really ahead of its time. It's still widely used today by like Demoscene and chiptune artists, and some of those guys came up with the Commodore 64, and some of those composers you're going to see in this episode. So,
Yep. And some of those composers you may already be familiar with, or we may have talked about before. So...
yeah. So as far as the Ghostbusters tracks, I definitely prefer the NES track versus the Commodore 64. Not that the Commodore 64 is bad, but it's just, that whole game just is tainted to me because it's so bad on the NES, and I've never played the Commodore 64 version, but because the game is the same, I can't imagine it's
because the Commodore 64 version is a downport of the NES version. Yeah.
Right. I mean, they were both 8-bit style systems in that sense, but you know, some people would say that the Commodore 64 had superior audio. I think it's kind of like in the eye of the listener, or the ear of the listener. The ear of the beholder. I definitely prefer this NES track, but again, it's like a year later. The track, of course, is originally composed by Ray Parker Jr., who did the original Ghostbusters theme for the movie. Yeah. David Crane, we think, did the Commodore 64 version, just because he's labeled as programmer, and there's no sound credits whatsoever.
Right.
So he's the only programmer that's listed. David Crane, of course, you know, famous for like Pitfall, like the whole Pitfall series. So
one thing about the Commodore 64, so I'm not sure if I understood this correctly, because I'm not someone who grew up with the C64. I think I've only ever played one once. My understanding is that the music doesn't play during gameplay. Music only plays during like menu or when you're sitting at a screen. Is that right?
It depends. So there are some games where it only plays and like there's very few tracks, and it'll only be like the main menu music. That happens. It's similar to the Amiga in the sense that you can't have sound effects and music at the same time. Some games will let you like pick and choose what you want, if you want just music or if you want just sound. So it really all depends.
Interesting.
Yeah. And then the new Ghostbusters 2 track, because that game was developed by HAL Laboratories, was done by Jun Ishikawa, known for almost every single Kirby game that's ever come out. So starting with Kirby's Dreamland in 1992, he was the sound composer on. So yeah, that's mostly what he's done. Arcana in 1992, which was that like RPG game.
Oh yeah, I heard of that.
Yeah. Box Boy and Box Boy in 2016, and then his last game was Bye Bye Box Boy in 2017. He was the lead sound designer on that, and then Kirby's Blowout Blast in 2017. So Jun Ishikawa is still a huge part of HAL Laboratories, still working today. So it's always nice hearing from him. He does great work.
Yes, he does.
Yeah.
So what are we going to start this shebang off with?
Yes, this shebang is getting shebanged with Golden Axe, which this is my pick. This is the Commodore 64 version. The way we're going to do this is we're going to play the Commodore 64 version, then we're going to come back, really brief, and we're going to introduce the next version of the song that we each picked. So I picked the Golden Axe. This is the Commodore 64 port that came out in 1990. The track is called Wilderness, and it's by Yaron Tell. Next, we're going to listen to Golden Axe on the Genesis, and this came out in 1989. This is also Wilderness, and this is by Nankyoku, also known as Yu Takada, as well as Deki and Imaki. right, welcome back. That was Golden Axe. That was on the Commodore 64 and Sega Genesis. The Commodore 64 version came out in 1990 and the Genesis in 1989, a year before. The track on both sides is called Wilderness, and that Commodore 64 version is by Yaron Tell, and the Genesis version is by Nankyoku and Deki and Imaki. Now, Nankyoku, we think, is Yu Takada, who worked on eSWAT and Gain Ground. He was never officially credited for this track, but really? Supposedly he did this track.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Deki and Imaki maybe are obviously like synonyms for, you know, whatever their actual names are, but I searched high and low and could not find any information on Deki or Imaki, so yeah. Pretty crazy. Yaron Tell is a long-time composer who started working on the Commodore 64 as like a demo scener, did a bunch of like retro soundtrack stuff like Starball, did the Savage in 1988. The Savage! Cybernoid, the Fighting Machine in 88. I'll just list a couple more. RoboCop 3 did the music on the NES and Commodore 64 versions.
But there was no RoboCop 3.
There was a game. It was based on a fan fiction movie that was not real. I refuse to believe that there was a third RoboCop movie. Yeah, worked on Cybernoid 2 in 2002, Rhino Rumble in 2002, did a port of Contra in 2006. I'm not sure what port that was, but Russian Attack, Gyrus, and Tiki Towers to Monkey Republic in 2011. He was credited as a Sound Howler.
Sound Howler?
Sound Howler, yeah. And then the Gyrus or Gyrus, I never know how to say that. I think that's just like an enhanced version that came out for the Xbox 360. Same thing with Russian Attack. So.
Are you sure it's not Hirus?
Yeah, I don't think so.
Gyro,
yeah. It always reminds me of that Simpsons episode, the one where Chief Quimby is like, yeah, let me get one of them gyros. Yeah, Gyrus, however you want to say it, and Russian Attack were both ported to the Xbox 360 as part of their like live arcade thing. So
very, very busy guy.
Yeah, he is.
He's still active today too. So.
Yes, Yaron Tell is working on, or at least he was working on, something called Tess and Tell, which was his at the time girlfriend, or I don't know if they're still together, or I don't know. That's not really any of our business, but yeah, he was doing a project with her called Tess and Tell. And then also, he's part of Maniacs of Noise, which was a demo scene group as well, if I recall. So, that is Yaron Tell. Yeah, he's done some really fantastic Commodore 64 stuff. It's kind of what he's known for. I love that little intro part, that really epic, like, dun, 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 dun,
very,
dun,
very
dun.
bassy.
Really epic.
I like it. The Sawtooth wave was very, very well used throughout his track.
I agree.
I would actually say that I prefer the Commodore 64 track to the Genesis track in this case.
Yeah, I mean, I like the Genesis track. I don't think it's a bad song at all.
No.
It's just, I think I prefer the arpeggios in the Commodore 64 version to the Genesis version, which is a little softer sounding. It's not as menacing. Yeah. I thought it's more like, it sounds more like an orchestral kind of vibe that they were going for. And to be honest with you, I think this is one of the best sounding orchestral style soundtracks on the Genesis. Yeah, because the Genesis, to me, has always struggled with orchestral sounding stuff. The Super Nintendo always blew it out of the water with that. So to hear a track that came out so early in Genesis's life cycle that sounds as good as this, like it's still very impressive to this day.
That's fair. I didn't hate the Genesis track. I just found that the Commodore 64 track, it felt more full to me. The Genesis track, it felt very high pitched, a little bit shrill at times.
Yeah.
Again, not to say that it was awful or anything. Like, I would listen to it again. I would play that game. I have played that game.
Yeah. Oh, the Genesis version is completely way more playable.
Oh yeah.
Than
I would imagine.
It's bad. I've played it. It's horrendous. It's very slow. It's just bad. Like, and that's unfortunately the thing with these downports is the games typically suffer, but the music doesn't. So that's kind of why we're showcasing the music, to kind of highlight at least one positive out of the game's ports. So.
That makes sense. Is it so bad that this is the kind of thing you would call a soundtrack delivery system.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. I would never ever recommend playing this game. It's just bad on the C64. Right. Genesis version's great game, very faithful to the arcade version for the most part. So
yeah, that's actually one of the other things that I noted about these two tracks, or rather, like the Commodore 64 track, is it kept very faithful to the track.
It did, other than the intro, little intro bit. Yeah,
the intro I think is kind of what took it over the edge.
Oh, absolutely.
The intro was really great, but then once it got into like the main melody, I was surprised at how much it sounded like. Because a lot of these other ones, we're going to play two tracks and they're not going to sound the same.
Right. So yeah, this is a really good example of the composer, or rather in this case the arranger, utilizing the full power of the Commodore 64 SID chip and really making it his own, despite the fact that he's really just arranging a track that's already been composed. So
right, yes.
All right, so what do you got for us? What are we moving on to?
So the next game that we're going to hear from is going to be Double Dragon. So we're going to start off with the Commodore 64 port of Double Dragon that was done by Melbourne House, not the one done by, I think it was Ocean.
Right.
This was released in 1988, and the track is called Title Screen, Arrival of the Black Warriors, and the composer on this is Charles Deenan. And next up, we're going to hear Double Dragon on the NES, that came out in 1987. The track is called Missions 1, 3-4, and 4-4. It's also known as Billy and Jimmy Lee's Theme, and that was composed by Kazunaka Yamane. All right, so we just listened to Double Dragon on both the C64 and the NES. The Commodore 64 release was the Melbourne House release, not the Ocean release. That came out in 1988, which was a year after the NES release in 1987. The Commodore 64 track was called Title Screen, Arrival of the Black Warriors, and was composed by Charles Deanan. And the NES track was called Missions 1, 3-4, and 4-4, also known as Billy and Jimmy Lee's Theme, and that was composed by Kazunaka Yamane.
Yeesh, what a mouthful.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, Kazunaka Yamane technically composed both. So Charles Deanan is actually the arranger. Right.
It's probably going to be the case in anything where the theme is the same. They're going to be an arranger. So that makes sense. Should have said that.
Double Dragon sounds like the name of a really bad adult film.
I'm sure it probably is.
Right? Like, oh, you're going to give me both of your dragons? Like
the Double Dragon. I feel like that is a thing, and I don't want to know.
If that is not a thing, it should be. I would say that the Double Dragon movie is pretty horrendous. It's one of the worst movies I've ever seen. One of the worst video game movies out there. I gotta say, all right, so musically, I was really impressed with the Commodore 64 version.
So was I.
Yeah.
I was actually really happy with it as it was going on. I really liked the driving bass line. I mean, the bass line is there in the NES version, but it was more prominent on the Commodore 64. I mean, we're a few songs in, and I'm already feeling like the Commodore 64 has a very, very strong, it has strong bass work.
Absolutely.
Which makes me want to go and listen to more Commodore 64 stuff.
I will say that the tempo is a little slowed down on the Commodore 64 version, and I actually really like that. It gives it enough room for the track to kind of breathe, and you get to hear all the different melodies. The problem, though, is that it starts to chop them up a little bit more. So it starts to, as the track, especially like in those crazy solos that you'll hear in the NES version later on in the track, it kind of like breaks those up a little bit, and so they don't sound as good.
No, I would agree. The guitar solo at the end on the Commodore 64 one, it made me smile, just because I thought it was really well done, especially with the hardware. I mean, when we got to it in the NES version, I was like, oh yeah, that's what it's supposed to sound like.
It's like when you see a little kid trying to do something like really adult. Like when a little kid comes in and they're wearing like big people clothes and like a big person hat, like a full suit, and you look at them and you're like, aw, you're trying so hard to be an adult, but you just can't.
Yeah, so that's fair. I feel like everybody's played this game, and I know that's obviously not literally the case, but everybody we know has played Double Dragon on the NES.
Yes.
And there's a whole lot to be said about like how classic this song is. It's the first level theme. There's a lot of nostalgia tied up in it.
You're gonna kill me, but I'm not that big of a fan of Double Dragon 1.
No?
I kind of feel like it's meh. I don't know. I like the Master System port a lot better, actually. And this is coming from a Nintendo dude.
Yeah.
Like, I reviewed this way back when, like years ago on my channel. And I did the Master System version and the Game Boy version. And overall, I like the Master System version the best. It had the best colors and the best, like, it was more modeled after the arcade game. In the NES game, it's more like you get to level up your abilities, like, as you get advanced in the game.
Yeah.
The second game I don't think does that. That's why I always like the second game a lot better. And also the second game was the first one I ever played. So that's, kind of the reason why I prefer the sequel to the original Double Dragon. Not a bad game, just not my favorite in the series.
That's fair. I mean, there are a lot of games, especially like first game in the series NES games, that I think I sort of feel the same way about. Like I'll see them and I'll be like, oh, I haven't played this in a while. I remember enjoying this game, and then I play it for a few levels before I'm just like, and I'm done.
Yeah, and the sequel was better, right? Yeah, I hear you. So Charles Deenan, I've never heard the name, but apparently he's done like everything.
Everything, yeah. He is listed for so many things. Out of This World in 1992.
Lost Vikings in 93. He did the original Super Nintendo soundtrack.
Yep. Yeah. He did the soundtrack for Mario Teaches Typing in 1992.
Oh, fun.
Wolfenstein 3D in 1995. So it's so dense.
Yeah.
There's so much stuff in here.
Baldur's Gate, a lot of the Baldur's Gate games. Need for Speed did a lot of the Need for Speed games.
Yes. A number of Star Trek games as well.
Yep.
Academy, New World, Starfleet Command.
Planescape, Skylanders, Star Wars Battlefront, just like mostly later on.
Favorite games? Saints Row 4.
Yeah, Saints Row 4. He was the re-recording mixer. He's done mostly like audio directing and sound supervising for the most part.
Yeah.
Like later in his career, not as much composition. Yeah, it looks like Need for Speed was like some of his last like audio work as far as composition goes.
Yeah, yeah.
And then Kazunaka Yamane pretty much just worked for the company that made Double Dragon, which I believe was Technos. Double Dragon in 1987.
Double Dragon 2 in 1998.
Yeah.
Super Double Dragon 1992.
Combat Tribes in 1990, which is kind of like a double. I can't really say a rip-off because the same company made it.
Right.
But it's kind of like, another beat 'em up, in the style kind of similar to Double Dragon.
Yeah.
So.
And then credited for original game music in Bobo's Big Adventure in 2012.
Yes, but that's mostly just
the original game music.
Right,
yeah.
Right. Also did a game called Shadow Force in the arcade, which is looking kind of like a Double Dragon clone as well. But it looks really impressive. I'll have to check that out.
Nice.
Well, it looks like Janine, our wonderful producer, is signaling us to pick up our very first Patreon-supported call.
Ooh, exciting.
Yeah, let's go ahead and take a listen. Hey, who do I have on the line?
Hey, this is Alex Messenger. I'm a patron of the show, and my pick is Stage 5 from Ghouls'n Ghosts for the Commodore 64.
All right, well, let's go ahead and listen to it. Hey, welcome back. That was Ghouls'n on the Commodore 64, and that was the 1989 port by Tim Follin. That track was Stage 5. And it looks like, we're getting another call. And
Already? Wow.
Yeah.
All right. Caller, you're on the air. What can we do for you?
Hey guys, this is Alex Bessinger again. Since this is a comparison episode, I want to compare my previous track, which was Stage 5 from Ghouls'n for the Commodore 64, to a track from Super Ghouls'n for the SNES, and that track is Ice Force.
All right, that sounds great. We can definitely do that for you. Hey, what's your favorite radio-based VGM podcast?
XVGM Radio.
All right, let's hit it.
Have you ever wanted to play the Commodore 64 on the go?
No, why would I?
Well, now you can! Thanks to Tramiel Industries, the Commodore 64 can be modified to soothe your Commodore 64 on-the-go needs. Call and order today, and we'll send you a prepaid box that you ship your Commodore 64 system and monitor to us in, and we'll use our secret technology to make your C64 portable.
Wow, that's oddly impressive. How does it work?
It's a secret!
Oh,
Okay. Well, look at that. It just arrived. Hey, the system just has a carved phone battery taped to it, and the monitor is glued to the console.
That's the Tramiel way! Order now for rush shipping between 2 weeks to 5 years. Just 6 low monthly payments of $49.88 with a down deposit of $4,000.
That's ridiculous. I'm not paying that.
Features a brand new game with an all-new Tim Follin soundtrack.
Sold.
Call 866-555-6464 today. Void in Utah. Note, portable battery may explode or corrode within 5 minutes of use. Warning, Tim Follin new soundtrack may melt eardrums. Seriously, void in Utah.
Welcome back to the XVGM radio podcast show. We just listened to the Commodore 64 version of Ghouls'n Ghosts Stage 5. The game came out in 1989 and was composed by Tim Follin. On the flip side, we also heard from Super Ghouls'n Ghosts on the SNES in 1991. The track we heard there was Ice Forest, and that was composed by Mari Yamaguchi.
Yes, I believe that's also Stage 5. Now that I think about it, because let me think. The first stage is the forest area where you're walking through, and then the second stage for Super Ghouls'n Ghosts is when you are in the water and on the ship.
Right.
The third stage is the Hell stage. The fourth stage is when you're in the stomach of the monster, and then I think the fifth stage is the ice caverns. So yeah.
Stage 5 versus Stage 5.
Yeah, pretty much.
Very different sounds.
Very different sounds. Well, Tim Follin was known for basically going his own way, and
that's fair.
It's totally fine.
Yeah, I think his way was very good. Mm-hmm. I very much enjoyed that. The one note that I made was I thought that it was a good use of a theremin.
Mm-hmm. Yes,
there was definitely some theremin sounds in there that I thought were really well done.
I just love that really eerie beginning. That it's like the wind is picking up and blowing really fast. Like, that's the thing I really love about his music, is it almost like in a lot of ways tells a story.
Yeah.
That it doesn't have to line up with the game, and in most cases it usually doesn't. So, and that's totally fine. I've not played the Commodore 64 Ghouls'n Ghosts, or if I did, it was like a while ago, like a long time ago or whatever, but I don't remember it being really good. The game itself, I just remember the music being great.
Yeah, well, I mean, Ghouls'n Ghosts was a ridiculously difficult game, so
yes.
you throw that on a downport, and it's usually harder to play when it's a downport, so you take a game that's just brutal to begin with and make it harder to play, and you might as well throw yourself off a bridge.
It's weird because Ghouls'n Ghosts is a sequel to Ghosts and Goblins.
Oh.
Ghosts and Goblins was originally on arcades and NES. The NES port was actually not done by Capcom, it was done by somebody else. And then the game was ported to the Commodore 64, and I think the music on that was done by Mark Cooksey, but it doesn't sound anything like this Tim Follin track.
No, not at all.
No, the two are just two totally different soundtracks. I think, if I recall, Mark Cooksey tried to use something a little more familiar to the Ghouls'n Ghosts, or the Ghosts and Goblins soundtrack. But when you compare this Ghouls'n Ghosts track to Super Ghouls'n Ghosts, or even just Ghouls'n Ghosts on the Genesis or arcade, they just don't really compare at all. So Tim Follin's just in his own magical land of awesomeness.
Which is where he belongs, I think.
Yes.
He's done a lot of great things from there.
Absolutely.
And this is definitely one of them.
Yeah.
On the flip side, the SNES track was a lot of fun as well. The low brass sounds that come out of there.
The bomb 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 bomb.
Yeah. They kind of bring me back to Link to the Past.
Yeah.
I know that they weren't done by the same company, so usually each company has sort of their own sound font.
Sure.
But that's just where it took me.
Yeah, I can see that.
I also really liked the use of the piano in the SNES one. It didn't sound like a lot of MIDI pianos don't sound enough like a piano to me, and this one did. I was really happy with the way that it came out.
Yeah, the sound on this game was so crucial to getting a proper mix of like orchestral elements with more like bombastic movie kind of sounds, and I think that the Ghouls'n Ghosts soundtrack overall for Super Ghouls'n Ghosts, the music really shines here. I would say, of the two tracks that we're talking about today, I'd probably go with the Tim Follin track, just because it's a little more up my alley. Yeah. But I have so much nostalgia for the Super Ghouls'n Ghosts track, so it's tough. Obviously, Mari Yamaguchi is a Capcom composer, so she started off with UN Squadron in 1991 and basically did the sound design on that. She did all the tracks except for one, which was done by Junko Tamiya. And then Super Ghouls'n Ghosts in 91, she did Mega Man 5, the soundtrack for that, which, I don't know, I normally really like Mari Yamaguchi, but I am not a fan of Mega Man 5 soundtrack. Yeah. Magical Quest starring Mickey Mouse, she did the background music on that. Street Fighter 2 Champion Edition did the music design, probably just like a port of the Super NES version to, I think, the Genesis. Final Fight 2, she did the music. She did the soundtrack for Breath of Fire in 93, and then she's credited for Mega Man 10, where she did a track or two.
Oh, nice.
So, and then Tim Follin, we've talked about before, Lord and Savior of video game music.
Absolutely.
All the way back to just stuff like Agent X, Ghouls'n Ghost, Bionic Commando, and
Spider-Man, X-Men, Arcade's Revenge.
Yep. Incredible Crash Dummies. Just, you name it, it's awesome. So,
Silver Surfer.
yeah, Silver Surfer, great music, bad game. So,
Oh, yeah.
But game-wise, I love Super Ghouls'n Ghost. It's a super hard game, but it's a lot of fun. I remember playing it growing up, and I loved it.
I remember having a lot more fun with Super Ghouls'n Ghost than I did with either Ghosts and Goblins or Ghouls and Ghosts.
Yeah.
I mean, Super Ghouls'n Ghost is a very tough game, but it was more fun to play. I felt like Ghouls and Ghost was way too punishing for me. Like I don't even think I got past the first level.
So Ghouls and Ghosts on the Genesis is a much more playable game, mostly due to the fact that there's not as much slowdown, and it's also a totally different game as well. But Super Ghouls'n Ghost, it just reeks of slowdown. There's just so much slowdown in that game. Interestingly enough, it got ported to a Capcom Generations collection, which came out on the Saturn. And so it's on a volume of that with Ghosts and Goblins, Ghouls and Ghosts, and Super Ghouls and Ghosts, and it's been retooled, kind of retweaked for that with the superior hardware, so it runs really smoothly, and it's like playing a totally different game.
And it is a port of the NES game?
So there's a port of the original Ghost and Goblins game. There's a port of I think it's either the arcade or Genesis versions of Ghouls and Ghosts.
Okay.
And then there's a Super Ghouls and Ghosts port, which is cleaned up quite a bit as far as the frame rate goes, so much less choppy. To me, I can't play this game without the choppiness, though, so even though it's more playable on that Generations version, they also kind of tease you with some new tracks on that Generation version. There's like some arranged versions of the music, and it's really, really good, but unfortunately it's not in-game music. That'd be really, really cool. So, all right, let's move on to our next game. What do you got for us?
So next up, we're going to listen to the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles arcade game, two different versions. On the Commodore 64, it was called TMNT The Coin Op. I think that might have been the European release.
Yes.
And that was in 1991. The track we're going to listen to right now is called Music 3 by Yaron Tell.
Cool.
Alright, and next up we're going to hear Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 2, the arcade game that came out on the NES in 1990. This track is called Scene 3 Part 1 and was arranged and composed by Kozo Nakamura. And you're back. So we just heard 2 TMNT2 tracks. So on the Commodore 64, that was Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles The Coin Op. The track was Music 3 by Yaron Tell, and that came out in 1991. And the second track was Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 2, the arcade game, which came out on the NES in 1990. The track was Scene 3, Part 1, and Kozo Nakamura is listed as the arranger and composer, and Yasuhiko Mano is listed as sound design, so I wasn't sure if they had any part in the music, but it's worth listing.
Yeah, possibly. There's a good chance that they had something to do with the sound. As far as the arrangement goes, they probably worked with Kozo Nakamura, either that or they did sound design for like the actual sound effects or whatnot. But,
right.
Yeah, so the Coin Op, I don't know, not a lot to it. It's a good bouncy beat, but it just kind of doesn't really go anywhere.
Yeah.
You know, it's not a bad track whatsoever. It's just kind of a meh track. But I love that Scene 3 Part 1.
Yes.
It is such a good track.
There's a lot more to it.
Yeah, Kozo Nakamura composed that originally, that track, because that track was not in the arcade game.
Right, correct. Yeah, I feel like so the tracks are not really the same at all, but no. I feel like there is a little bit of almost like the bass line of the main track on the NES is present in the Commodore 64, and I don't know if that was done on purpose. I don't know if there was any attempt to try to make the song sound similar to the arcade or the NES ones. And neither do I. A lot of the NES tracks actually have sort of the Turtles theme built into them.
Yes.
And none of the tracks that I heard on the Commodore 64 had that. So.
Right. Yeah, a little bit more like electronic, almost like electro style, especially with that dum 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 dum. It's got that bounce like hip hop step vibe to it, but I think that the Kozo Nakamura track it's an interesting track because it's so different from the rest of the soundtrack. It doesn't really have that TMNT, like da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. It doesn't have that in there. It's got a very kind of like Solitude-esque vibe to it. That's what I get. And maybe that has a lot to do with the fact that it's a snow-based level.
Right, yep.
That's a good part of the reason why that may be the case. But this is one of my favorite levels to play through just because it was so different. And I remember playing the arcade game as a kid and then coming, renting this game and bringing it home and playing it and being like, this wasn't in the arcade game.
A whole extra level.
Yeah. Wow. Gee willikers, mommy.
Yeah, no, it's definitely a really fun game. I actually had not played the arcade game until later in life when I eventually came across it at Milford Rec, Smiles, whatever we want to call it.
Sure.
It was there at one point, but I'd played the NES version a whole bunch, so I sort of had the opposite experience because I played it with friends in the arcade so that we could actually get through everything, and I was like, where'd the snow level go?
Yeah.
But it was still really cool. I mean, the arcade game looks a little bit better. It's definitely. I think it's a 16-bit.
Yeah, more 16-bit style and design and everything. I mean, it's built on better hardware in terms of technical specifications. But I still thought it was really impressive that they were able to cram the entire arcade game and additional levels. And that Konami sound style, typical Konami sound into a Turtles cart. And I often wonder what this would sound like with additional audio support, like if it had like an FM, like a synth chip built into it, like the VRC7 or like the VRC6 or, one of Konami's chips like built into the Famicom cart. Like that would have been so awesome.
Oh, you're talking about like the Famicom stuff.
Yeah. Like if there was like additional chips in there, like the VRC6 or 7. So
I thought you were going to say like if it had been composed on the arcade cabinet.
Oh, right.
So that would sound very different too.
Well, if it was a VRC7, then you probably could have brought the tracks from the 16-bit game version over because that was all
right.
That was all FM synth style. So, but yeah, with this wavetable stuff with the NES, it's just phenomenal. It's all really well arranged by Kozo Nakamura, working on all the music that came over from the arcade version. So
Yeah.
even though the coin-op version on the C64 gameplay-wise looks and plays similar, it's definitely a more run-down version of the NES port.
Oh yeah. No, there's it definitely harder to play, a little bit more frustrating, I would say.
Yeah, but Kozo Nakamura, who, I mean, we already talked about Your Own Tell earlier in the podcast, so we don't really have to talk about them, but Kozo Nakamura did quite a bit of stuff.
Back in 1988 on Biomiracle Bokute Upa,
Yes.
they did sound design, but I mean, they did one of my favorite games, or they at least did sound editing on one of my favorite games, Gradius 3. But getting into the music stuff, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles in 1990.
Turtles 3, The Manhattan Project in 91, Lone Ranger.
Monster in My Pocket.
Yep, great game, Zen Intergalactic Ninja in 93. Rakuga Kids in 98, that was a N64 Japanese and European fighting game that Konami put out. It's kind of like kiddie style. Rakuga Kids, really fun game. Did Goemon Mononoke Sugoroku. Castlevania Legacy of Darkness did sound effects on. Pretty much been a Konami composer up until Konami Crazy Racers in 2001.
So
good stuff, And a lot of those tracks from Konami Crazy Racers came from earlier Konami games. So pretty much like remixing and rearranging those tracks. So our last pick, which is my pick, is from Strider. And we're doing the Commodore 64 version. It is composed in 1990 by Patrick Cuppins or Mark Tate. I'm not sure which one, but it's one of those two. So let's go ahead and give it a listen. The track is Unknown.
Ooh.
Alright, coming up next is Strider, the arcade version, and this came out in 1989. The track is called Siberian Wilderness Drive Wheel, and this is by Zor. Alright, welcome back. You just listened to Strider on the Commodore 64 and Strider on the arcade. The Commodore 64 version came out in 1990. That was by either Patrick Cuppins or Supins. I'm not sure how to pronounce that last name. He also goes by Lyon, apparently, Lyon. Either that or it was composed by Mark Tate. I was not able to find that much information on this. Coincidentally enough, the composer for the arcade version is Zor, with X-O-R. That's his name. There's no information whatsoever online about Zor. I couldn't find anything. So,
Stage name, mysterious
composer. Strider has mysterious people involved. So that was, the 1989 arcade release. That track was Siberian Wilderness Drive Wheel. So I gotta find out your thoughts on these two. What do you think?
So I'm going to lead with the fact that I actually prefer the Commodore 64 track over the arcade track.
Okay.
I thought the arcade track was really nice, but the thing that won me over on the Commodore 64 track is it had a very techno vibe to it.
Yes.
And
a very synth pop vibe,
yes,
I would say.
Very techno synth pop.
Yeah.
I really enjoyed the pitch bend that they did that they used in there, but just overall like the sort of dark techno synthy vibe that it had going.
That bass line, that dig it. Yeah, love it.
It actually kind of reminded me of the Techie Pocky track from a while back. It had the same sort of like dun thing going on. The arcade track, not particularly bad. I found, so for one, it's a very Capcom track. Again, that's not a bad thing. I love Capcom music. Like they have so many good games with great sounds.
Definitely.
The thing that I feel in the arcade track that kind of lost me is the bass, sort of like the driving bass line got a little muddy, and it kind of was just this sound in the background while they had this really cool like an ice track. It had those higher tones, the higher pitched like chimes and stuff.
Kind of like a pitter patter in a way, like a do 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 with those like synths like towards the beginning. But what really hooked me on the arcade version was actually that bass line, that in
the beginning. I thought it was really good.
It was really like thunderous sounding, and in the front lines you've got kind of these like more twinkly melodies that kind of came in. It was very progressive to me, like very like prog rock, prog metal kind of vibe I got, mixed with a little bit of Fear Factory for those like those bass lines. So
that's fair.
That's kind of where it hit me as far as this track goes. But
I thought it started off really strong. And then just I mean, I don't know if it was a combination of other things, but towards the middle and end of the track, the like bass didn't feel as strong, and it just felt kind of muddy.
Okay,
and, like,
I guess I could see that.
The melody and whatnot was a lot stronger, and that's where my mind was. But like the bass is what drew me in, and when you draw me in with that, and then you kind of put it away, I'm like, but okay, well, I don't care.
But what about that bass that was over there? What about that bass? So no, I totally, I totally get you. The Commodore. So basically, we flip flop. So I preferred the arcade version. You preferred the Commodore 64 version. So that's pretty interesting. So not a lot of information about these composers. As I said, I know nothing about Zor. I couldn't find any information on Patrick Coopins. Coop. I don't know. Let's call him Coop. P-Coop. Let's go with that. And then Mark Tate, who is listed as an arranger or composer. I found his name somewhere on the web, but ultimately when I looked him up, his name wasn't actually listed. I found it credited in one spot for the game, and then in everywhere else on the internet he's not credited. So if he did do it, then we can attribute it to him. And he also did like Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, the action game, in 1989, Call Me Psycho in 1988, Better Dead Than Alien in 88, which is an awesome name for a video game. Better Dead Than Alien. And then HKM in 1989, and then the last game he came out with was another port that was Black Tiger. That was a Capcom port in 1990. Interestingly enough, the company that worked on a lot of these Capcom ports was US Gold.
Yes.
So they actually published it. The game was developed by Tiertex for the Commodore 64. They did the Amiga, the Amstrad CPC, the Atari ST, the Commodore 64, the DOS, and the ZX Spectrum versions.
Wow.
So basically they did all the home computer versions of this game. But that is the deal. And then of course this game was ported later on to the Genesis, and the arcade and Genesis versions are very comparable.
Yeah.
That sold very well for Sega, which was pretty good, and that's why they decided to make a sequel, which flopped. But
And then they just put them in all of their Marvel vs. Capcom games.
Yes, and then in Strider also had Strider 2, which came out on the PlayStation 1, which I think also had a port of the arcade game on it on a second disc. Strider 2, that one's a little more expensive now. And then Strider fairly recently was rebooted into Strider, which came out in 2014 2014, I think, or 2016.
Oh.
Yeah, and that's a crazy reboot. So that's like a more up-and-coming reboot for Strider. Strider always, to me, felt like the Captain Falcon of Capcom, in the sense that he didn't really ever feel like he belonged, in Capcom's lineup of games. I don't know. Like, I always would look at Strider and be like, I don't really consider Strider a Capcom character. I mean, I know technically speaking he is, but just like the vibe I got from Strider was always like an outsider vibe.
Oh,
you know what I mean?
Yeah.
I
can't think of many other games that Capcom made that were like that. I mean, it was, if I remember correctly, they're action platformers, right?
Yes.
I kind of remember them being almost like a Ninja Gaiden in a way.
A little bit, yeah. There's a bit more of a focus on like grabbing onto, like being able to essentially grab onto things above you and then like kind of cascade yourself, like, move yourself on like these ladder rungs almost, or like walking across like with your hands, like different platforms and stuff, gripping onto like iron grates and being able to use that to your advantage when it comes to platforming. There was a bigger focus on, I wouldn't say bigger focus on platforming, I would say that Strider for the NES, that port, which was not even really technically a port, it was more like just a completely different game. So yeah, I don't know, I dig the Strider games, they're pretty cool. I think that the arcade version is better than the C64 version, but graphically speaking, the C64 version is very impressive for its time, despite the fact that they kind of like flip-flopped a couple levels, like level 3 and 4 I think are flip-flopped.
Interesting.
Yeah, like the port makes it so that the arcade version, level 4, is actually the Commodore 64 version of level 3 and vice versa.
Yeah
Weird stuff, but yeah, so can't really talk about the composers because we don't know. So that's pretty much it as far as our episode goes. So I thought this was a lot of fun.
Yeah, we haven't done a versus type episode like this.
Yeah.
And it was definitely interesting to do. I mean, this particular topic, as we said in the beginning, was a challenge to do research for.
Definitely. Yeah, it was tough to gather music for it, and tough to try to figure out what would go kind of hand in hand as far as music goes. But it was interesting to see the different tracks line up. Some of them actually lined up based on the stages that they were in, which was really cool. So final thoughts on your favorite tracks, and that includes like all the Patreon supported tracks. What was your favorite track of the episode?
The new Ghostbusters 2 track was really good, but the Golden Axe Commodore 64 track and the Strider Commodore 64 track,
okay,
they both feel like they're very much my type of music and right up my alley. But if I gotta choose one, I think I'm gonna go for the Golden Axe track, mostly because it felt very faithful to the original Golden Axe. That gets a lot of points, and then it had that extra bit of that opening, which I thought was a really well done opening.
Absolutely.
I will also mention that the Tim Follin track is highly ranked as well. There's no real good reason why I didn't pick it, other than the other two tracks just grabbed me a little bit more. But that one is a very close third.
Okay. Yeah, it's tough. Okay, so I'm going to say for the non-Commodore 64 tracks, I would go with Strider. I was kind of very much impressed with Strider's music going through it to pick songs for this episode, and this track it's that chuggy bass that really kind of grabbed me. Otherwise, for the Commodore 64, I mean, I've heard the Ghouls'n Ghost track and I love it, but I'm going to give it up to Your Own Tell for the Golden Axe track. Yeah, same here.
Yeah.
I really dig that. I also want to give a special shout out to that new Ghostbusters 2 track, that intro track. That was really good as well. And I'm, again, same as you, I'm really bummed that game never came out here. But. So we want to thank Alex Messenger for being part of our Patreon crew. He picked tracks based on the level of tier that he was donating to for the Patreon. So if you are interested in signing up for our Patreon, it's patreon.com/XVGM radio. So we want to give a shout out to all of our Patreon donators, our patron supporters. So Scott McElhone, Chris Myers, Chris Murray, Cam Warma, and Alex Messenger. Thank you so much for being part of our Patreon. Find out again how you can also be part of this list on patreon.com/ XVGM Radio. You could also check us out at facebook.com/groups/XVGM Radio. We want to know what your thoughts were on these tracks and which one was your favorite.
Yes, we do our favorites at the end of every episode. The members of our Facebook group also tend to chime in and tell us what their favorites were. You can be part of that. If you're not on Facebook, you can email us at xvgmradio@gmail.com.
Yep. Yeah, we'd love to hear your thoughts as well. I've also like to give a shout out to the VGM Podcast Fans group, which Alex has formed. You can check that out at facebook.com/groups/VGM Podcast Fans. So lots of really cool people talking about video game music. A lot of other video game music podcasters also in that group as well. So really good people talking about good music, all good times. So you could check us out on iTunes as well. Please give us a rating, a review, and just let us know how we're doing. If you like the podcast, what you want to see, if you want to see more, it's always really helpful for those ratings because it gets the word out there about the podcast.
Yes. And lastly, if you want to check us out on social media, you can find us on both Instagram and Twitter. We are at XVGM Radio.
And of course, xvgmradio.com for all your XVGM Radio needs.
Yes.
Yeah.
Episodes get posted there, and you can read other posts about things when they happen. Like when we got our Instagram, we posted there. You can see more about us, as well as any guests that we have on the show. From episode 5, we had Coda on, and he is listed under our guests section. So
Yes.
you can read more about him and find him on the web if you
Absolutely. And every person who goes to XVGM Radio gets a free chicken nugget.
like him. How are we going to do that?
We'll figure it out.
All right.
Yep. So,
One free chicken nugget.
one free chicken nugget.
Limited one per person
Yes.
per lifetime.
Yes, per lifetime. Episode 8 coming up is Dat Sunsoft Bass, Mr. Gimmick. We are talking about the FME7 chip. And I'm very excited to talk about this topic.
Yes, this is I think our first time really digging into the Famicom.
And we're talking about one specific game,
yes.
and one specific chip, which was in that game. But most importantly, we're going to be talking about Dat Sunsoft Bass. That's right. So from XVGM Radio, this is Mike,
And this is Justin.
signing out.
The Commodore 64 release was the Melbourne House release, not the Ocean release. That one came out in 1998, a year after... God, did I say 98 again?
Yeah.
That one came out in 1988, a year after the NES release.
Try it one more
Yeah,
time because
yeah.
I was laughing.
Yeah.